They were still up there. All of them. And one of them had turned its head toward the sound of the rain. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened inside that barn. I need you to understand that I am not a man who frightens easily. I grew up in these mountains. I have walked creek beds at 2 a.m. I have put down animals I loved with my own hands and slept fine afterward. I tell you this not to brag, but because I want you to feel the full weight of what I am about to say. What was hanging in that tobacco barn was not leaves. It never was. My name is Elias Cutter. I am 53 years old, and until the autumn of last year, I had not set foot on my grandfather's property in Harlan County, Kentucky, in nearly 30 years. The old man, Harlan Cutter, my mother's father, had died in September. A Tuesday, I was told, quietly in his chair, the way men like him always seem to go, as if even death had to wait for an invitation before it came inside. There was no service. Harlan had outlived everyone who might have attended one. The estate fell to me by default. A paralegal from a firm in Lexington mailed me a manila envelope containing a deed, a hand-drawn map of the property lines, and a single handwritten note in my grandfather's script that read only, "Do not open the big barn after August." It was October when I arrived. Now I want you to picture the drive up. Not because the road itself matters, it doesn't, not really, but because the land does. Because the land in that part of Harlan County does something to you before you ever step out of the car. The trees grow close to the road in a way that feels intentional, like they leaned in over the decades and nobody ever pushed them back. The light comes through in long amber columns that look almost solid, and everything underneath them, the ferns, the creek mud, the old fence posts, everything is just slightly too dark. The farmhouse itself was smaller than I remembered. Funny how that works. You spend years building something up in your memory, and then you stand in front of it, and it's just a gray, clapboard house with a rusted tin roof and a porch that sags on one end. I walked through the rooms in about 20 minutes. Dust, old furniture, a cast iron stove, a calendar on the wall from 1987 that no one had ever taken down. It was when I came back outside, when I turned around to get my bag from the truck, that I saw the barn for the first time. I say for the first time because I have no memory of it from my childhood. And that is strange. because it is not the kind of thing a child forgets. It sat at the far edge of the property, maybe 200 yards from the house, half swallowed by the tree line. 5 stories tall. That is not an exaggeration. 5 full stories of dark vertical plank siding, the boards warped and black with age and weather, fitted together with the kind of tight, overlapping construction you only see in old tobacco barns, built before men started cutting corners. Ventilation slats ran the full length of each story, narrow as knife wounds, angled slightly downward, and through them I could see nothing. Only a darkness so complete it looked almost purple. A tobacco barn, the old kind, the curing kind. The smell reached me before I had even crossed half the distance to it. Sweet. That is the first word that comes to you. Sweet. But wrong. The way something sweet becomes something else when it has been sitting too long in a warm, still place. It was the smell of dark-fired tobacco, yes. That deep, smoky, almost molasses-thick smell that clings to the back of your throat. But layered underneath it was something older, something vegetal and faintly wet and faintly not. I have thought a great deal since that night about why I went inside. I have turned it over the way you turn over a stone you already know has something unpleasant beneath it. The honest answer is that I thought I needed to. That there might be equipment inside worth cataloging for the estate. That the note said after August, and it was now October, and I told myself that meant the restriction, whatever it was about, no longer applied. I told myself a great many things. The door was a sliding barn door, the kind on a rusted iron rail, and it was heavy enough that I had to put my full weight into it. It moved with a long, low groan that seemed to come from the whole building at once, a sound less like metal and wood and more like a complaint, like something lodged deep in the chest of a man who has been breathing too shallowly for too long. Inside, the light was amber, not warm amber, the amber of old resin, of things preserved under pressure. It filtered through those ventilation slats in long, flat planes, and the dust motes inside them were so thick and so slow that watching them was like watching snow fall in a dream. They drifted. They did not hurry. Nothing in that barn hurried. The floor was packed earth, dark and dry as ash, and it made almost no sound under my boots. The walls on the ground level were lined with wooden shelving, old curing equipment mostly, iron hooks on wooden pegs, coils of wire, tin cups and glass jars, some filled with dark liquid I did not open, a rusted hand pump that connected to nothing I could see, and hanging from the rafters above, far, far above, rising up through all 5 floors of that massive structure, were the bundles, hundreds of them. They were the size of men. No, I did not think that then. That is a thing about the brain. It protects you. It looks at a thing it cannot process, and it finds the nearest acceptable explanation, and it holds on to that explanation with both hands. So what I thought in those first moments was simply that my grandfather had been a prolific farmer, that these were simply very large, very full bundles of tobacco leaves, hung the old way, in the old style, the way they used to cure whole stalks rather than individual leaves. They hung in rows along wooden rails that spanned each floor, strung with coarse rope at the top, and they were wrapped, or rather they had settled and compressed over time into shapes that were long and narrow and slightly swollen in the middle, the way a hammock looks when someone is lying in it. The outer layers were a deep, oxidized brown, the color of old leather, of creek bark, of the soil itself, and they were dry, so profoundly, impossibly dry, that standing beneath them felt like standing inside a clay jar with the lid sealed tight. The air did not move in that barn. I found the curing logs near the back of the ground floor, on a workbench that had been built against the interior wall. They were ledgers, the long, cloth-bound kind, 7 of them in a row, each one dated on the spine in faded ink. The oldest was from 1887. The most recent was from 1971. I opened the 1971 one first. The handwriting was my grandfather's. I recognized the long, sloping, lower-case letters, the way he always wrote his 9s as if they were small anchors. The entries were sparse and methodical. Dates, temperatures, notes on humidity levels inside the barn, remarks on the quality of the cure. But the thing was, there was no tobacco noted, no pound weight, no variety, no buyer, none of the commercial information that would ordinarily fill a working curing log. Instead, there were names, first names, only first names, 1 per entry, sometimes 2 if a given year had been, and here I am reading his exact words, so listen carefully. Fruitful, Earl, Damon, Roy, Carvis, Sula, Little Tom, Gid, and beneath each name a single word that he had written in a different color ink, as if he'd come back to it later. Cured. I closed the ledger. I set it back exactly where I had found it. And then I stood very still in that amber light, with the dust motes drifting around me, and I listened to the barn breathe, because it did breathe in a way. The ventilation slats allowed just enough air movement that the bundles above, all those hundreds of bundles, shifted faintly in their ropes, not swinging, not swaying, just settling. Millimeter adjustments, the way a sleeping thing adjusts when it finds a more comfortable position. That is when I noticed the sound. It was beneath the settling, beneath the slow creak of rope and rail. It was a dry sound, papery and very faint, like the sound of a moth's wing dragged slowly across old parchment, like the whisper of something unfolding. I looked up. On the third level, through the gaps in the open plank flooring that allowed the heat to rise during the curing process, one of the bundles had changed its orientation. It had been hanging perpendicular to the rail, the way all the others hung. Now it was at an angle. The lower end of it had come slightly away from the main body, separated, spread open, and it caught the amber light differently than the others. There was texture there that had not been visible before. A seam, a crease, the shape of a jaw. I should have left the barn. I know that. I have known that every day since. But there is a particular cruelty in the way real fear works. It does not send you running the way it does in moving pictures. It pins you. It fills your legs with cold water and your mouth with the taste of copper, and it makes you stand absolutely still. Because the most ancient part of your brain has decided that stillness is the only armor it has left. And in my stillness, I heard the rain begin. October rain in Harlan County comes in sideways. It comes with weight. It began against the walls of that barn like 1,000 flat hands pressing all at once, and within moments it was seeping, not flooding, just seeping, through the gaps in the old board siding. A fine, cold mist of it. It touched my cheek. It touched the packed earth floor, and the floor darkened in small, spreading circles, and the smell of sweet rot deepened and shifted and became something else entirely. Became alive in the way the dry ground smells alive when the first rain finds it. And from above me, all at once, came the sound, crackling. Not the crackling of a fire, nothing so bright or so quick. This was slower. This was the crackling of a thing that had been folded for a very long time, carefully straightening itself out. The crackling of paper, of dried skin, of a husk that had compressed over decades into a shape it was never meant to hold permanently, now remembering, in the presence of moisture, that it had a different shape underneath. The bundles were unfolding. Not all of them, not quickly. It was happening the way ice cracks in spring, in sequence, one triggering the next along the rail, a slow cascade of small sounds moving from one end of the barn to the other and back again. And as they opened, as those papery, desiccated outer wrappings peeled away from the shapes within, I could see them more clearly in the light that filtered up from the ground floor where I stood. They were thin, impossibly thin, the thinness of something that has had every drop of water pressed from it over years and years. Their skin, if you could call it that, was the deep brown of cured tobacco leaf, traced through with pale raised veins like the veins of a leaf held up to sunlight. Their arms, because they had arms, long and angular and folded against their sides like the wings of something roosting, were beginning to extend downward, slowly, without urgency, the way roots grow, the way time moves. Their faces were the worst part. They did not have features exactly, not the way you and I have features, but there were suggestions. There were contours where eyes might have been, deep-set recesses in that papery, brittle face, and below them a thin horizontal crease that parted slightly as the moisture reached them, and moved like a mouth deciding whether to open. And when it opened, when that crease parted, there was a sound from inside it that I cannot describe well in any language I have. It was the sound of something very dry being held near something very wet and wanting. It was the sound of pure, ancient thirst. My grandfather's note had said, "Do not open the big barn after August." August, the dry month, the height of curing season, when the air inside that barn would have been so desiccated, so hostile to moisture, that whatever process kept those things dormant would have held. When the humidity outside was at its lowest, when there was no rain to seep through the boards, when a man could walk inside that barn safely, if there was any safe way to walk inside it at all. October, the rain month, the wet month, the rehydrating month. I do not remember crossing the ground floor. I do not remember getting my hands on the sliding door or finding the strength to move it. I have only the memory of cold rain on my face and wet grass under my boots, and the sound, still audible even at a distance, even over the rain, even over my own ragged breathing, of papery, crackling things continuing to unfold in the dark above the ventilation slats. I drove for 4 hours without stopping. I have not returned to Harlan County. The property is listed with an agency that handles rural estate sales, and the attorney who handles the listing has been instructed not to describe the barn in the listing photographs. I told him it was for aesthetic reasons. He did not question this. What I think about in the nights when I cannot sleep, when the rain hits the windows of my apartment here in Cincinnati, and I pull the covers up and I lie very still. What I think about are the names in those ledgers: Earl, Damon, Roy, Carvis, Sula, Little Tom, Gid, and the ones in all the other ledgers. All the years between 1887 and 1971. Dozens of names, one per entry, one per year in the dry years, two in the fruitful ones. And the word he always came back to write in that different ink, as if it were an accomplishment: cured. The barn had a capacity, is what I'm saying, a designed capacity. 5 stories, hundreds of rails, hundreds of bundles, and my grandfather kept meticulous records, the way a careful man always keeps records, right up until 1971, the year I later realized that he stopped taking in farmhands for the harvest season, the year the neighbors stopped seeing unfamiliar trucks on the county road that led to his property, the year Harlan Cutter became, by all local accounts, a solitary and somewhat peculiar old man who kept to himself and tended a farm that no one ever saw produce anything. He was not producing anything. He was preserving it. One thing I did not mention, because I have not been able to think about it clearly until now, here at the end of telling you all of this. One thing I did not mention is what happened as I was running across the field toward my truck in the rain. I looked back once. I know you're not supposed to. Every story and every instinct tells you not to look back. But I looked back, and through the ventilation slats of the uppermost story, the 5th floor, the one nearest the peak of the roof, I saw a shape that was pressed close against the slats, that had arranged itself close against the slats, that was tilting its contoured, papery, vein-traced face outward into the rain. And the slats, those narrow ventilation slats, angled downward, designed to let air move through without letting weather in. They were not designed, it seems, with everything in mind, because the shape on the 5th floor was opening its mouth and catching rain. Sleep well.